Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Confederation Club's November webinar. We appreciate you signing up for this evening's webinar. It's an exciting presentation and an exciting topic that we're really looking forward to presenting. I'm Barb Shackleton, Director of Marketing for the Confederation Club. And this evening we have Brian Porter, who is going to be presenting on Sir John A. Macdonald, seen through the eyes of his contemporaries. This is a different angle through which to see Sir John A. Macdonald. For those of us who love Canadian history, it's an opportunity to see him through a lens which is a little bit more unique than perhaps what we've been hearing in the press recently. So a couple of housekeeping tips this evening to keep in mind. We are going to be doing a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like to pose, please use the Q&A tab and just ask your question, and we'll address those at the end. Secondly, we are recording this webinar so that you can share it in future and watch it again. And we will definitely send out a link with the information about that. We'll have also Stephen Cage, who's going to be conducting the questions, and I'll just go through a little bit about Brian Porter. So a bit of a bio. Brian was an elementary school teacher in Brockville and attended Peterborough Collegiate and Vocational School, and is a graduate of Carleton University, and of course has a BA in history, and is married to Renee. And you can see the picture of both Brian and Renee here in a traditional, I guess it would be 1812 uniform there, and two daughters as well. And we're living in Toronto. So great background in terms of understanding the history and being in that area. He has obviously interests that are historical in nature, being a founding member, actually, the Brockville Infantry and historical reenactors, which really keeps history alive and in a context that is meaningful. I won't necessarily read through all the details here, but suffice to say that Brian's interests are substantial, and he's able to really help to bring an understanding of Sir John A. Macdonald's context and when he lived to life. Adding to his interests and his background as well, he has numerous publications and awards for
I lost you. I've got no volume here.
Sorry, it looks as if we've just lost Barb, so I'll just continue on.
Okay.
So, oh, and now I've lost the screen there. Perhaps people can read the previous screen, and so we'll just go straight into your presentation, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on Sir John A. Macdonald.
All right, well, I'll get started here. No, are my pictures going to come up in the next little bit, I hope?
Yep, there you are.
Well, good evening. I'm Brian Porter here in Brockville, City of the Thousand Islands, and I'm pleased tonight to be able to talk about Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister and preeminent father of Confederation. Now, Canada did not happen by accident. John A. Macdonald has an essential role in the story of Canada. During a remarkable 47-year parliamentary career, he served 23 years before Confederation and 24 years after, and laid the foundation of one of the most successful countries in the world today. He was the right man in the right place at the right time in our history to lead in a difficult struggle against great odds. His leadership showed vision, courage, determination, and perseverance to build a new nation across the northern half of North America, which was destined to become either British North America or part of the United States of America. He acknowledged the need for compromise and said, "This experiment we are trying also required prudence and moderation if it was to succeed." This was a fragile country with a small population stretching across 6 time zones and trapped between two powers, the British and Americans. Next door to our powerful, aggressive neighbor. Despite our many fault lines, Macdonald pulled it together, and we have made it work for 153 years, one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world, after the UK and the USA. So we can stand tall, with no need to be so apologetic and so self-effacing. This critically important leader is now being vilified and demonized by historically uninformed critics, projecting 21st century attitudes, values, and beliefs back in time, and condemning Macdonald for seeing the world differently than we do today. They show contempt for him and a total lack of understanding of the many factors at play in how Canada came to be. This complex and interesting man, with all his flaws, led a life of ambition, hard work, and political drama, showing great resilience and strength of character. Amidst heavy family responsibility and tragedy, he still maintained a buoyant sense of humor. So he deserves to be better known by all Canadians for his many accomplishments. His is the ultimate immigrant success story, and Canada is his monument. To give us a better understanding of the man, I want to look at Sir John A. Macdonald as seen through the eyes of some of his contemporaries, people who saw him in action. So the slides that we would have seen, here we are, the younger John and the older John A. Over a series of years here. 1889, this is the portrait painted and given to him by the party. And this was the uniform, his Privy Councillor's uniform that he was buried in 1891. So the younger John A. In the first slides, which you didn't get a chance to see. So we'll start now with, are we okay here, Barb? John Langton?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, here we go. So in 1855, John A. was a 40-year-old member of cabinet, and John Langton was a legislative member for Peterborough, and he was our first Auditor General. He said about Macdonald, who was soon to become Premier of Canada West, "He can get through more work in a given time than anybody I ever saw, and do it well. His talent was undoubted, and his character for integrity stood very high. He is fond of pleasure and has an almost boyish exuberance of animal spirits. His instincts are all good, but he takes the world too easily to be much depended on." Well, that was to be proved wrong. Many years later, on the 7th of June in 1889, at age 74, John A. received an honorary degree from the University of Toronto, and one reporter noted, "His physical alertness still matched his astounding buoyancy of spirits. He was an old man with a strangely youthful elasticity of spirit." The next, no, I don't have a picture of the next two. The next two quotes are one is from Sheridan Hogan from Dublin. He was a lawyer, a journalist, and an MLA from Grey County. And he said about Macdonald, "He was so good-natured to men on both sides of the house and never seemed to remember an injury or resent an attack after it was past." Then we come to Robert Spence, also from Dublin, a journalist, a teacher, and an MLA from North Wentworth. He was in cabinet with John A. under Premier Allan MacNab in 1854 to 57. And he wrote to Macdonald to say, "I am of the opinion that with all your appearance of almost continual mirthfulness, you are not without your seasons of serious reflection." This is very true. Next slide. Now, this is Senator John Boyd from New Brunswick. And he is quoted as saying, "Like President Lincoln, Sir John Macdonald was an example of the men who are most thoughtful and yet most cheerful, who perhaps could not carry the heavy burdens of care had they not a merry heart to keep them. I remember how on a trip down the Bay of Fundy, while Lady Macdonald discoursed with Captain Thompson about the coasts and the tides and the currents, Sir John sat with me, full of fun and story, glad to shake off the weighty cares of state for even a day." Next. Now, even his political opponents often had some good things to say. Especially telling is this anecdote from Liberal MP David Thompson. He was from Haldeman, and he had missed almost an entire session of Parliament, and he reported on his return. Well, the first man I met coming back was Blake. That would be Edward Blake, his own leader. He passed me with a simple nod. The next man I met was Cartwright. Now, Richard Cartwright was in the Liberal cabinet, and his greeting was as cold as that of Blake. Now, hardly had I passed these men when I met Sir John. Now, he didn't pass me by. He grasped me by the hand, gave me a slap on the shoulder, and said, "Davy, old man, glad to see you back. I hope you'll soon be yourself again and live many a day to vote against me, as you always have done." Now, I never gave the old man a vote in my life, but hang me if it doesn't go against my grain to follow the men who haven't a word of greeting for me and oppose a man with a heart like Sir John's. Next. This is Senator Hector Fabra. He was a Liberal senator appointed by Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie in 1875, and he was sent over to Paris as our diplomatic agent in 1882. And he said, "An actor Sir John undoubtedly is, graceful and pleasant in bearing, quick and ready in word and action. He acts his speeches as much as he delivers them. He acts with voice, head, and gesture. The inflections he gives his voice awakens his dormant energy. He warms to his work, the hand ever in motion. And yet he is too clever, too well versed in the knowledge of mankind to be cruel. His executions are always amusing. They extort a smile even from his gloomiest victims themselves." Next. Now this is Sir John Willison. He was the editor of the Toronto Globe from 1889 to 1902. And this paper, under its founder and editor, George Brown, had kept Macdonald under relentless attack. And Willison wrote in his Reminiscences, Personal and Political, "Sir John Macdonald was neither a popular orator nor a parliamentary debater of the first order. He was, however, a profound student of character. He had humor, adaptiveness, and readiness. He could break the force of an attack with a story or an epigram. He had that mysterious quality of personal magnetism which gives to its fortunate possessors a strange and mighty power over their kind. He deemed no man beneath his attention. He had clear and definite ideals, and he could face a popular clamor with signal courage. It was no common man who so touched a nation's heart, and as time passes, we see his stature more clearly, and we forget the way in which some things were done in gratitude for all that was achieved." Next. The next picture now should be Sir Wilfrid Laurier. You're going to get this picture? In his very eloquent epitaph for Macdonald in the House of Commons on the 8th of June in 1891, Sir Wilfrid Laurier said, "For the supreme art of governing men, Sir John Macdonald was gifted, as few men in any land or any age are gifted. He was also endowed with those inner, subtle, undefinable graces of soul, which win and keep the hearts of men. And as to his statesmanship, it is written in the history of Canada. It may be said without any exaggeration whatever, that the life of Sir John Macdonald from the date he entered Parliament is the history of Canada." Our next slide should be Sir Hector Langevin. Now, Sir Hector was a father of Confederation and Quebec leader after Georges Cartier died, and he was Minister of Public Works. And he wrote to his brother from London during the final negotiations with the British government in December of 1866. "Macdonald is a sly fox. He is very well informed, subtle, adroit, and very popular. He is the man of the conference." Now, even British officials, who were often inclined to be arrogant and condescending towards officials from the colonies, were impressed by Macdonald's strength and personality. Now, this next slide is Sir Frederick Rogers. During the negotiations for Confederation in London in December of 1866, Sir Frederick Rogers was the permanent undersecretary of the Colonial Office, and he noted, "Macdonald was the ruling genius and spokesman, and I was very greatly struck by his power of management and adroitness. He stated and argued the case with cool, ready fluency, while at the same time you saw that every word was measured. He was never for a moment unconscious of the rocks among which he had to steer." Next. Now this is Lord Dufferin, our Governor General, from 1872 to 78, and Macdonald was out of power for most of this time. But he wrote in a dispatch home saying, "Macdonald is charming in conversation, gentlemanlike, with excellent manners, quick apprehension, good-natured, placable, and magnanimous, with great faculty for managing other people." In a letter to Lord Kimberley at the Colonial Office in 1873, Dufferin wrote, "Macdonald was very popular among his opponents. Above all things, it is remembered, it is to his skill, talent, and statesmanship that the Dominion has its very existence." In a later letter to the Colonial Secretary Hicks Beach in September of 1878, Dufferin wrote, "Sir John is undoubtedly the ablest politician in the country. In fact, he is the only man I have yet met who is entitled to be called a statesman." Next. Now, this is Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister. And on a trip to Britain in 1879, Sir John was sworn into the British Privy Council by Queen Victoria at Osborne House in the Isle of Wight. And he was thus designated Right Honourable, the Right Honourable Sir John A. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, over at his place, Hughenden Manor, wrote in his diary, "He is gentlemanlike, agreeable, and very intelligent. A considerable man. He lacked Yankeeisms, except that little sing-song at the end of a sentence." Now, I think by that he might have meant John A. would put A at the end of a sentence. Canadians are known to say A at the end of a sentence, eh? Next. Sir Charles Dilke was Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs in Britain, 1880 to 82, under Prime Minister William Gladstone, and he wrote about Macdonald. "Sir John Macdonald's chief outward note is his expansiveness, and the main point of difference from Disraeli is the contrast between his buoyancy and the well-known Sphinx attitude of Disraeli. Macdonald is the life and soul of every gathering in which he takes part, and in the exuberance of his antique youthfulness." Next. Next slide is Lord Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon, Earl of Carnarvon, was Colonial Secretary, and he was the man who introduced the British North America Act into the British Parliament. And he had Sir John out for a visit to his place, Highclere Castle. Now, many of you watch Downton Abbey. In the opening credits, you see Highclere Castle, and I can picture Sir John arriving at Highclere in his carriage. And then Lord Carnarvon visited Johnny in Canada in 1883. In his diary, he wrote, "Sir John stands like Saul, head and shoulders above his contemporaries and colleagues, and wherever he might be, he would have made his mark." Next. Now, the next two slides are colleagues of Macdonald, longtime colleagues. And this is Mackenzie Bowell from Belleville, who became our 5th Prime Minister in 1894. He was Minister of Customs for 13 years with Macdonald, and he spoke at the unveiling of the first Macdonald statue erected in Hamilton in 1893. And he said, "While he delighted in the thought of ruling and guiding the destinies of his country, no man ever more freely courted the frank opinions of his colleagues. No man ever listened with greater attention to such opinions, and no man more readily yielded to the judgment of others." So he was easy to work with. The next we come to is Joseph Pope. Joseph Pope was John Macdonald's secretary for his last 9 years, and later his biographer. He commented, that Macdonald was exacting in his demands, but no life could be more pleasant than constant association with a statesman who ever conveyed the impression to his secretary that he was a co-worker with him in a common cause, who rarely gave a direction unaccompanied by an explanation of the reasons for it, who courted suggestions of all kinds, and even invited criticism of his own work. Now I'll come back for a moment to Sir John Willison. I have no slide here. He was a longtime editor of the Globe, and he wrote about John A.'s attractiveness to women. John A. had the devotion of women in remarkable degree. It is rarely indeed that a political leader touches the hearts of women, and only those who do it have that strange quality of attraction which we call magnetism, which God gives to so few of his creatures. The truth is, he was seldom coarse. He laughed at himself as freely as he laughed at his political opponents. And because women know men better than they know themselves, and better than men ever suspect, there was among women a passionate devotion to Sir John Macdonald such as no other political leader in Canada has inspired. No man of ignoble quality ever commands the devotion of women. Next. Now, this is Lady Agnes Macdonald. This was John A.'s second wife. They married while he was in London in February of 1867. So he came back to Canada with a new constitution and a new wife, as he said. She was 31 years old at the time, and he was 52. Now, in the early years of marriage, keep Lady Agnes there. In the early years of their marriage, Agnes kept a diary, and we get some insight into their relationship as well as his character. And she is the only woman, Canadian woman, to receive a peerage in her own name. After his death, she was given the title of Baroness Macdonald of Earnscliffe. So she sat in the British House of Lords and followed politics over there. So in July of 1867, she wrote, "He can throw off a weight of business in a wonderfully short space of time. Oftentimes he comes in with a very moody brow, tired and oppressed, his voice weak, his step slow. 10 minutes after, he's making very clever jokes, laughing like any schoolboy with his hands in his pockets and his head thrown back." November 1868, "He likes me near him. He is so equable and so good-natured that being near him is always refreshing. I tell him that his good heart and amiable temper are the great secrets of his success. He is so thoroughly patient and gentle in spirit. It's quite remarkable in so hard work, so busy, so thoughtful a man, the humblest, least assuming, most gently judging of mankind." Later in 1868, she wrote about some job appointments. "My lord and master, who in his private capacity simply lives to please and gratify me, is absolutely tyrannical in his public life, as far as I am concerned. When I pressed on him an appointment, Sir John looked very benign, very gracious, very pleasant, but he answered not one word. He never does." Lady Agnes wrote articles for British magazines, Murray's Magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, and so on, and she was quite a good writer. And after they took their trip through the Rocky Mountains in 1886, and she sat up on the front of the cowcatcher all through the Rockies for 600 miles, and she wrote a story for Murray's Magazine called "By Car and by Cowcatcher." And it's a very interesting piece to read. Well, the Canadian folk group Tanglefoot even wrote a song about this in 2002 called "Agnes on the Cowcatcher." Quite an interesting song. I want to talk a little about women voters. In January of 1885, in a speech in the House of Commons in his franchise bill, John A. talked about women having the vote. And Joseph Pope, his secretary and biographer, said that John A. believed that women were largely conservative in their views. He was the first leader in the Western world to propose giving the vote to women. And in his speech at the time, he said, "I believe the time is coming, though perhaps we are not any more than the United States and England quite educated up to it. I believe the time will come, and I shall be very proud and very glad to see it when the final step towards giving women full enfranchisement is carried in Canada. Later that year, in 1885, at Victoria College, which was a Methodist college in Cobourg, he again talked about women getting vote. I also thank the ladies of Cobourg for their beautiful floral gift. When I get home, my wife will probably ask how I came to get the gift. I will tell her it was because I promised, as I do promise to you, to do my utmost to get the ladies the right to vote. Now, his wife, Lady Agnes, disagreed with this, and she is quoted as saying, "Those silly women do more harm than good, as women generally do when they put their dainty fingers into the political pie." So there's a lot of opposition to women having the vote, including from some women. Next. Well, John A. was 30 years ahead of his time. A generation later, this major change came about. Women first voted in Canada in Manitoba in January of 1916, Saskatchewan and Alberta in March and April that year. The federal government enfranchised all female citizens over 21 in May of 1918, and they first voted in the general election of December 1921. 5 women ran, and Agnes MacPhail of the Progressive Party won the Grey Bruce riding as the first woman elected to our parliament. So there's a picture of Agnes MacPhail. Now, John Collins, in his biography of 1883, called The Life and Times of the Right Honorable Sir John Macdonald, wrote, "Macdonald addressed several meetings composed of riotous men inflamed with whiskey and the worst passions of party. An eyewitness said, never did he lose his temper. He good-naturedly waited till there was a lull in the disturbance. When silence was restored, he said he knew many of the electors, that they were all manly fellows, too manly indeed to refuse another fair play." So like President Abraham Lincoln, Macdonald could break the force of an attack or a criticism with a story or an epigram. So I'll give you 2 examples. The next slide. Well, this is Edward Blake. He's leader of the opposition from 1880 to 1887. He once complained about the small amount of government legislation. And John A. replied, "Well, the honorable gentleman says there's only one government bill on the paper. Well, you know the old fable about the rabbit and the lion. The rabbit said to the lion, 'I have 20 children to your one.' But oh, said the lion, 'but my child is a lion.'" Next. Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie. The National Working Men's Union of Canada held a mass meeting in Toronto in May of 1881, and unions were just getting organized in these days. And John A. was there to defend his national policy of higher tariffs to protect Canadian industry. And Liberal leader Alexander Mackenzie and his party favored free trade with the United States, and they opposed these higher tariffs. So John A.'s response was, "Mr. Mackenzie says, well, we don't intend to disturb the manufacturers. We are going to educate them to free trade by slow degrees. We will show the people the fallacies of protection." Well, this is something like the Dutchman, who tried to reduce the feed of his horse by slow degrees from half a bushel of oats to a single wisp of straw, and thus do away with what he called the extravagance of the oats. And unfortunately for his experiment, just as he was about to succeed, the horse died. So John A. liked to toy with the opposition with various stories and various other humorous anecdotes. Next. Now, this word portrait was painted by Charles Longueuil, a Liberal MP from Montmorency. He sat across from Sir John in the House of Commons in 1887. John A. is 72 years old. His eyes lively, his look pleasant, a charming smile, an enormous mass of curly hair, a slim build. His walk was an elegant nonchalance, and a nose that made up his whole glory. I'm going to talk now a little bit about some Indigenous leaders. John A. Macdonald, far more than other public figures of the time, knew Indigenous people personally. He had defended several in court in his younger days. And some early friends included mixed bloods, such as the Reverend Peter Jones and John Culbertson. His granddaughter, Daisy, attended a school run by a Métis woman in Ottawa. He was close friends with Dr. Peter Martin, a Mohawk medical doctor from Six Nations, and the founder of the Independent Order of Foresters. And he even went so far as to name his son John Alexander. In February of 1885, in his franchise bill, Indigenous men in Eastern Canada were given the vote, and they became full citizens without giving up any treaty rights. He was successful in getting this through against fierce criticism from the Liberal opposition. In 1898, it was scrapped by the Laurier government, and the vote was not brought back for Indigenous people to 1960 by Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. Next slide. Chief Peter Jones. In August of 1886, Dr. Peter Jones, he was an MD, was chief of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And he wanted to, Johnny wrote to Dr. Jones saying he wanted to place Indians on a footing of equality with the white brethren. I hope to see someday the Indian race represented by one of themselves on the floor of the House of Commons. Now, many of the chiefs at the time opposed this enfranchisement as a threat to their authority. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien ran into the same attitude when they proposed ending the Indian Act of 1876, when they brought up their white paper in 1969. Now, some Indigenous leaders even wrote to thank Macdonald for his efforts on behalf of their people. And in 1878, Chief Archibald Cuthbertson and 5 other Mohawk chiefs at Tyendinaga prepared an address to Macdonald, congratulating him on his recent victory. And in part it reads, "We cannot refrain from telling you the peculiar pleasure we experienced on hearing that you had become the head of the Department of the Interior and consequently Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, as we have long been aware of the great interest you have always taken and shown for our people in this Dominion." So go back to Peter Jones again. In June of 1885, Peter Jones, chief of the Mississaugas of the Credit, wrote to congratulate Macdonald. "My dear Sir John, I should have written to you some time ago to thank you for making the Indian a person in the franchise bill. Other affairs, however, prevented me from performing my duty. I now thank you on the part of my own band, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and in the memory of my father, the Reverend Peter Jones, and on the part of myself, as for many years we advocated and urged this step as the one most likely to elevate the Aborigines to the position most approaching the independence of the whites." Next slide. So this is Chief Charles Big Canoe and Band Councillor James Asquabi of the Georgina Island Ojibwas on Lake Simcoe wrote to thank the Prime Minister for his earnest efforts to promote the welfare of the Indian people throughout the whole Dominion. "We appreciate your difficulties in dealing with our less civilized brother in the Northwest, who has not had the advantages we in Ontario have had. We thank you most cordially for the gift of the franchise." Now, another tribute came from Chief Mitchell Chubb and the 5 band councillors of the Alnwick Band up on Rice Lake. And they sent a memorial to endorse the extension of the franchise in 1885. Whereas the Right Honourable Sir John A. Macdonald, Premier of Canada, Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, proposed and obtained the consent of Parliament to the enfranchisement of the Indians of the older province of Canada, and whereas he also eloquently advocated our rights and protected and defended our character and good name from the insults and slanders of our enemies, therefore, be it resolved that we, the Chief and Council, offer on our behalf and on behalf of our band, our heartfelt thanks to him, our great Chief, and tell him we shall always gratefully remember his goodness, justice, and the honor and dignity he has conferred upon us, and we shall teach our young men to follow in our footsteps in remembering his great character and cherishing the memory of his good words and noble deeds. Next. Now this is John A.'s granddaughter, Mary Isabella Macdonald, nicknamed Daisy. John A. called her Puss. And she attended a boarding school in Ottawa run by Abby Maria Harmon, who was very proud of her Cree blood ancestry on her mother's side and her father's reputation as a fur trader and explorer. Now, Daisy Macdonald, she married a fellow named George Gainsford, and her son Hugh Gainsford lived in Winnipeg and had two adopted children. And his great-grandson, Hugh Gainsford, died in Saskatoon in 2014 at age 96. So there are no direct descendants. And his granddaughter, Isabella here, Daisy, said in later years, "I'd rather be in hell with John A. Macdonald than in heaven without him." So she quite liked John A. Macdonald and his great good sense of play. Now we come to another comment from his formidable political opponent. The next slide. This is the House of Commons on the 8th of June, 2 days after John A.'s death. And on the left, you see the John A.'s desk with the wreaths on top. And Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Liberal leader of the opposition, in his very eloquent epitaph, he's looking across at the desk of Sir John A. The chamber is draped in black crepe, as you can see in the picture, and as was his desk. Sir John Macdonald now belongs to the ages, and it can be said with certainty that the career which has just been closed is one of the most remarkable careers of the century. His actions always displayed great originality of views, unbounded fertility of resources, a high level of intellectual conceptions, and above all, a far-reaching vision beyond the event of the day, and still higher, permeating the whole, a broad patriotism, a devotion to Canada's welfare, Canada's advancement, and Canada's glory. Now, Macdonald, in his approach to politics, he took a very good-natured, optimistic, humorous approach to politics. We'll just call up the next slide there. One of my favorite pictures. In a letter of advice to Sidney Smith from Coburg, who became the Postmaster General in the Macdonald-Cartier government in 1856-58, he wrote to Smith, "You owe it to all of us, however, not to allow family feuds or personal animosities to interfere with your calm judgment. Politics is a game requiring great coolness and an utter abnegation of prejudice and personal feeling." Then there was this optimistic comment. "When fortune empties her chamber pot on your head, smile and say, 'We are going to have a summer shower.'" Now, the secret ballot did not come in until 1874, and politics in those days was a real blood sport, especially in the early days in the British North American colonies for sure. Booze and bribes and intimidation were not uncommon during elections certainly before the secret ballot came into play. Now, Macdonald was addressing Sir Wilfrid Laurier in an 1889 speech from the throne. Well, the honorable gentleman says of his following, "We are a small body." Well, why are they a small body? Because the country does not give them the same confidence it does us. Now, the honorable gentleman knows that under the dome of St. Paul's in London, there is a celebrated epitaph to Sir Christopher Wren. "Si monumentum requiris circum spica." If you seek for a monument, look around you. Well, I say the same thing in the humble spirit. Look around at the prosperity of the country. Look at the undiminished confidence which the people have in us from one end of the country to the other. That is our best monument. And I expect by and by to see something of that kind inscribed on my tombstone. "Will he see his own tombstone?" asked Mr. Patterson of Brant. "Now my opponents say I will be looking up at my tombstone. I will be looking down on my tombstone, and I will be looking down on the Conservative majority, which I shall leave in such good spirits that they will carry on the traditions that have guided them since 1854. But he admitted in 1882, "I have committed many mistakes. There are many things I have done wrongly, Many things I have neglected that I should have done. I've tried, according to the best of my judgment, to do what I could for the well-being of good government and future prosperity of this, my beloved country. I believe that Sir John A. Macdonald deserves to be better known by all Canadians. Canada is his monument. And as his biographer Richard Gwynne wrote, no Macdonald, no Canada, as we know it today. So we can honor his great accomplishments. We can also acknowledge the mistakes were made, and we continue to make improvements. So who was this man, Sir John A. Macdonald? He was a man of strong character, with an outgoing, optimistic, convivial personality, a gregarious, sociable man who enjoyed being with people and could move easily in all levels of society. He had a great sense of humor, a quick wit, did not take himself too seriously. He was a man of charisma and charm. He set the template for sunny ways in politics. He used humor and storytelling to relieve tensions and to make a point, as did Abraham Lincoln. He was a highly intelligent man with much generosity of spirit. He loved politics and was good at it, but at sometimes a bit too crafty. He was a man of courage, determination, and perseverance. He was able to make tough decisions over his long career in government. He had a clear vision of the kind of country he wanted Canada to become and had a passionate love for his new country. He had flaws and blind spots. For about 20 years, he used binge drinking to help him cope in stressful times, but he would bounce back and carry on. He used delay as a political tactic and was sometimes too wily as a politician. For example, he used what he called the double shuffle in 1857 to defeat George Brown and the reformers after only 2 days in power. But the West was a blind spot, with poor understanding of the Métis and the indigenous population. He did want them to get educated and to be integrated with the larger population and to take their place in Parliament, which was a more enlightened attitude than was common at that time. He was a liberal-minded man for his time, quite accepting of human weakness in himself and in others. So we can acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. But we need a better understanding of the man, his life story, and his times. We need to honor his significant positive achievements on behalf of Canada. I'll end with this speech in the House of Commons in 1890, the year before he died. John Macdonald said, "The statement often made that this is a conquered country is a propos de rien, has no meaning. Whether it was conquered or ceded, we have a constitution now under which all British subjects are in a position of absolute equality, having equal rights of language, of religion, of property, and of person. There is no paramount race in this country. There is no conquered race in this country. We are all British subjects. And those who are not English are nonetheless British subjects on that account." So I'll end there. And if there are any questions, we can discuss them.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for a very interesting and informative presentation. We're now moving into the moderated question and answer phase of the seminar, of the webinar. Some questions were pre-submitted by Confederation Club members. However, if webinar participants would like to submit a question for Brian to answer, please submit through the question and answer function. I see we already have one question in that function right now. But please keep your questions short, no more than 2 or 3 sentences, so we can get through as many questions as possible. And so the first question, how would you compare party politics in Macdonald's time to party politics today?
Party politics was a little less organized in his time, for sure. He used to talk about trying to win over the loose fish. There wasn't as much party discipline. He was very much in favor of parties getting well organized, and he began that process of parties getting organized and not having so many members, as he called the loose fish. Well, he was very good though at trying to win over the loose fish and get them over to his side. He even made a comment about Laurier at one time that if I was 20 years younger, I could have won him over too, but that wasn't going to happen. Macdonald was a charming sort of fellow and was willing to listen to all points of view. Phil's quotes there, politics was pretty much a blood sport, and people followed it very closely. Almost every city or town had two newspapers, one liberal and one conservative. Here in Brockville, the Recorder and Times was the liberal paper, and then we had the Brockville Times, the conservative paper. And in Toronto, George Brown's paper was very, very hard on Macdonald. The Globe was constantly attacking Macdonald. And so the Conservative Party went ahead and set up their own paper, the Empire, and later the Mail, to try and counteract this constant attacks from the Globe. So you have to be, when you're trying to read about Macdonald and some of the archival stuff, you have to be careful which newspaper you're reading. But yeah, politics was less organized, but started to become a little bit better organized in his time.
Great. Okay, next question. How important was the National Railroad to Canada? Do you think there would even be a Canada if the railroad wasn't built?
The railroad was critical, absolutely critical. There was no way, this massive amount of geography, when such a small population, when Canada was formed in 1867, our population was under 4 million people. And Macdonald realized with all the annexation talk in the United States coming from presidents like Ulysses Grant and Rutherford Hayes and various others, there was a lot of talk of annexation down there. In 1867, just a day before the Confederation Act was passed in the British Parliament, the U.S. bought Alaska. So already the various members of Congress and various newspapers were talking about this is just the beginning of the pincer movement, that we would eventually take over the whole of North America. So the railroad was absolutely critical to pulling it all together. And so here we are with a country of about 4 million people trying to build the world's longest railway at that time. Trying to finance it was extremely difficult. And Macdonald was determined it was going to get built. It almost bankrupted the country, but they did get it built. And it was absolutely critical. I believe that if it wasn't built, the Americans would have continued to move in on the West, and Canada would likely end at the Ontario border. I'm convinced of that. It was that important.
So we've got a question online. Are you a descendant of Sir John A. Macdonald's family? You have a look very similar to him.
No. The lighting in my room tonight, I look like an alcoholic with my red complexion. I know I'm wearing my Campbell tartan, and on the wall behind me you can see my wife's quilted version of a Campbell tartan. John A. Macdonald, Macdonald's and the Campbells were the Campbells and the Macdonalds were at each other in the Highlands, and so perhaps having a Campbell tonight is appropriate to defending a Macdonald. My father's mother, my grandmother, was a Campbell, and so yes, I do have some background in that way. But Macdonald has no. I've been told many times when I've made presentations about, people come up to me and say that they had some relative who was related to Macdonald and their family, and I have to assure them that there are no direct descendants from Macdonald. Maybe distant.
Next question. What do you say about Macdonald's critics on Aboriginal affairs, including his part in founding the residential schools program?
The first thing you have to say is that Macdonald did not found the residential school, and the CBC and other news outlets always want to say he was the architect of these schools. He was not. Residential schools were started by the various religious denominations long before Macdonald ever entered politics. They had been long in use, and when the federal government began to put money into the schools, and when they built the treaties out west, or they made the treaties out west, written into all of the treaties was that there would be schools, and the various chiefs wanted these schools. And how do you reach the most remote people? The residential school was the only way to do it, and Macdonald was convinced of the importance of education. But the churches had complete control over these schools, and the federal government, increasingly as the decades went by, long after Macdonald's death, they began to realize that they had virtually no control over these schools. They were doing pretty much what the churches wanted them to do. And in the 1950s, the federal government is starting to make some effort to get control of these schools and their curriculum and so on. And until 1960s, they finally, late 1960s, they finally took complete control. But Macdonald is being held up, being vilified today for all the abuses that went on in these schools. Most of those abuses went on long after he was dead. And every single prime minister for the next 20 prime ministers, these schools were in existence. And I don't know why Macdonald should have to be the scapegoat for all the abuses that went on. He was not the architect of these schools.
We have a couple of related questions online. What would be your answer to those who want to pull down his statues today?
I think we need to honor his significant positive achievements on behalf of Canada, and I think it's a shame that we should be seeing a man of this critical importance in the foundation of this country being vilified the way he is and being demonized the way he is by having his statues torn down and paint thrown on him and one thing and another. I think he's a man worthy of being honored. There's such a complex story in his 47 years in Parliament of how all the struggles he went through from the chaos of the 1850s to getting this country started, the 24 years that he stayed in power, or was in power after Confederation to hold this country together and consolidate it. This Canada today is a successful country and was built on the foundation that he laid. The rule of law, the British parliamentary system, absolutely critical to this country that we have today. And John A. needs and deserves to be honored. And there are simply many critics out there are writing a judgment on this man, and they know very little about Canadian history, I think.
Great, thanks. Next question. Shortly after the US Civil War, Russia was looking to sell its North American territories, now known as Alaska, and ended up selling these territories to the United States. Why didn't Canada make a stronger effort to buy Alaska, especially as Canada would be a more natural neighbor?
In 1867, Canada was in no position to buy it. We only had 3.5 million people at Confederation. The government's revenue was very, very limited. The sources of revenue were very limited, mostly customs duties. So we had no money. We had no ability at that point to do this. The British were controlling British Columbia, and the Americans this was one part of their way to try and get control of the whole western coast. They were quite interested, and they'd even offered at one time to buy British Columbia. So they're making a move all around to try and get control of this land. But Canada, this little nation of 3.5 million people, was simply in no position to be able to buy it, even if they knew it was for sale.
Good. In 1864, just 3 years before Confederation, Macdonald was part of the Great Coalition, formed with George H.N. Cartier of Canada East and Macdonald's political rival, George Brown, which eradicated political deadlock, allowing Confederation negotiations at famous conferences in Charlottetown and Quebec to move forward. What was Macdonald's relationship with Cartier and Brown?
Cartier and Macdonald had a very strong relationship for 18 years. And it's a shame that Cartier died of Bright's disease in 1873. He was a great loss to Macdonald, a great loss to the country. Hector Langevin became the Quebec lieutenant after that. But with George Brown, there was never any friendship. These two guys simply did not get along. Macdonald could get along with just about anybody and everybody. He could not get along with this big Scot who was very sure of it, super confident, very sure of his opinions and everything, always sure that he was right on everything and was not about to bend, and kept Macdonald on relentless attack in his newspaper. So I will give George Brown credit, though, for reaching out to Macdonald when there's absolute deadlock. Governments were forming and falling all through the late 50s, 60s, early 60s, and we got to break this deadlock, and the Maritimers are talking about some kind of a union down there, so it's time that maybe we should go down and talk to them about a bigger union. So you have to give George Brown credit for at least trying to break the deadlock, and they managed to put up with each other for during the Confederation conferences. Then Brown went right back to attacking Macdonald until he was assassinated in 1880.
Good. Can you comment on the foreign relations aspect of Macdonald's government, particularly that with the US, given their Western expansion taking place at the same time and their approach to Indian affairs.
Right. In 1871, when we began our treaties, the Western treaties, there's a series of treaties all through the right through the 70s. That's 1871. We're starting our first treaty in the West, and that was that same year that the U.S. gave up on this treaty process and they turned their Indigenous affairs over to the Department of War. So they took a very different approach. And Macdonald, all through his entire life, was always concerned about the U.S. attitude. During the Fenian raids in 1866 and 1870, he was Minister of Militia, and as well as Premier. And he was very concerned about the Americans were not doing anything to keep these Irish Fenians on their own side of the border, and they attacked us at Ridgeway in 1866, and 9 young Canadians were killed there. So it was a serious threat. And after Confederation, although you must give the Fenians credit because they gave us a little boost to get on with this idea of Confederation, because there was a lot of resistance to getting Confederation underway. So then all the years afterwards, we had President Johnson was president, and when John A. Confederation was started, he didn't send any recognition up to Canada at all, none whatsoever. And then when Johnson was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, and there was 6 Republican presidents, one right after the other, and Macdonald was trying to deal with these guys, and there was a strong annexation talk coming out of the White House, coming out of the American press. And there was talk about, there was a group coming out of Minnesota and the Dakotas that were infiltrating the Red River settlement. They were helping Louis Riel and the Métis out there. There was Enos Stutzman was a lawyer, for example, who was helping the Riel drop his list of rights and so on. And so they were hoping, these Americans were hoping that if the Red River colony could be broken away, that they would be quite a weak colony, and the Americans had been able to move in quickly and annex it. So there was constant stuff going on in the background on the U.S. side of things. As we get into the 1880s, you get the tariffs, and the presidents are looking to bring in the McKinley tariff. Now McKinley was from Ohio, and he later becomes president, but he's bringing in the McKinley tariff to put high tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the U.S. So we'll have this constant tariff war going on. We had a free trade treaty with them in 1854. The Americans decided to single-handedly abandon it in 1866. We tried desperately to get it going again. The Americans didn't want any part of it. They were constantly coming into our fisheries on the East Coast, and Macdonald finally sent in some ships and started boarding American ships and taking command of the American ships to get them out of our fisheries. So that really angered Ulysses Grant and other presidents. So he's trying to stand up for this little country of ours. So all along in the background, through his entire time, there's always this worry about what is the United States up to. They were simply very interested in annexing Canada if they could, to pay for the damages done by the ships that the South had built in Britain during the Civil War. After the Civil War, the suggestion was made, well, we could make up these damages that these ships, that these British-built ships could, by just simply ceding us Canada, that we could be done with it all. So there was always this constant background noise that he had to be aware of about what was going on over the border. The only time he was down in Washington was in 1871 for the Treaty of Washington, and he had the Brits and the Americans both mad at him because he kept standing up for Canada. I mean, neither side liked this. Who is this pipsqueak guy coming down here and not giving in? And he didn't want to sign this treaty. The British said, well, okay, we'll give you $2.5 million through railways to kind of quiet him down a little bit. But the Americans are going to have access to your fisheries and so on. So he said, well, I'll sign it for the sake of peace. But I know I'm going to be attacked when I get home. And of course he was. And so he didn't have good relations. When he went down to the Treaty of Washington, nobody came to meet him. He only met the president when the president said hello and goodbye. So there was no direct contact with the American president, but they did contact through the British ambassador. So yes, there was always this worry about what was going on across the border.
Great. We're on to our final question. What books or movies would you recommend on Sir John A. Macdonald if you wanted to learn more?
Well, we don't make a whole lot of movies in this country, but I can certainly recommend some books. The one maybe in the background behind me, you can see Richard Gwynn's 2 volumes.
Right?
There's those are excellent. They came out 07 and 2011,
Right.
and they're very readable. And I think Richard Gwynn has done a terrific job of portraying Macdonald. The earliest major study of Macdonald was 1950s. Donald Creighton from the University of Toronto, and he's got a much more detailed look at Macdonald, but it's also a very excellent study of the man and the man in his time. Another shorter volume, a single volume, came out. This is Johnny Macdonald by Jed Martin. Now, Jed Martin was, this is put out by Dundurn Press in Ontario. Jed Martin taught Canadian studies in the University of Edinburgh for all of these years. And this book only came out 6 or 7 years ago. So it's Johnny Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. Another book came out in 2015 on the 200th anniversary of Macdonald's death, of Macdonald's birth rather, and it's called Macdonald at 200. And it's a series of essays, New Reflections and Legacies by Patrice Dutil and Roger Hall. And it was put out also by Dundurn Press. I don't know if that'll show or not. And so that's a series of essays, some critical, some not. And I would certainly, any of those books I would certainly recommend if you want to get a better understanding of this man. Pierre Burton's early history is also, especially building the railroad, give you an understanding of how difficult this was to get done. And an American contractor got the contract to go through the mountains, and he was the one that decided that he'd try and cut costs by bringing in Chinese migrant laborers. And so that became a controversial issue at the time. But they could make $1 a day here and 3 cents a day in China. But they weren't allowing the Chinese to emigrate at that time. So he knew they would have to all go back home, and there was an awful lot of prejudice at the time. So Pierre Burton's studies are also very readable as well. So I think and Christopher Moore is another historian here in Canada. Has written Macdonald has written a couple of books about the Fathers of the Confederation, which are both very good. So I would definitely recommend Richard Gwynn's book. So.
Good. Well, thank you very much. It looks as if our host, Barb, is still not back online, so I'll sort of wrap up the webinar. Thank you, Brian, for a very interesting and informative presentation. It's a real shame that the founder and first Prime Minister of Canada is being misconstrued so badly these days. I want to thank all of our webinar attendees. There will be a short survey question at the end of the webinar, which we'd appreciate you answering. And the next webinar will be announced, next Confederation Club webinar will be announced in the next few days. So thank you once again. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Thank you.